G20 Summit Live. World leaders arrive in Johannesburg. Zambia takes center stage. Good day, viewers. Welcome to another edition of InspirAfrica Official. I'm Nakash. What a week it's been, my friends. As we approach the weekend, the world's attention has turned to the African continent in ways we haven't seen before. And today, we bring you a story that's unfolding right now in Johannesburg, South Africa. Picture this: the gleaming terminals of Tambo International Airport, security details flanking every corner, motorcades stretching for miles. World leaders touching down on African soil for what is being called a historic moment. The G20 Summit, that exclusive gathering of the planet's most powerful economies, is happening right here in Johannesburg. For the very first time, Africa hosts the G20. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. While presidents and prime ministers gather in the glittering conference halls of Johannesburg, another drama is playing out just beyond South Africa's northern border. In Zambia, something extraordinary is happening. Chinese Premier Li Qiang, representing the world's second-largest economy, didn't fly straight to the summit. No, he made a very deliberate detour to Lusaka, the Zambian capital. Why? What could be so important that it would pull China's number 2 leader away from the most important economic gathering on Earth? Is this about copper? Is this about influence? Or is this about something far more strategic, a chess move in the great game of African infrastructure and global power? And what does it mean that while the United States boycotts this summit entirely, calling South Africa's hosting a disgrace, China is instead doubling down, signing billion-dollar deals and shaking hands with African presidents? The questions multiply. Why is Zambia suddenly at the center of global attention? What railway line could possibly be worth $1.4 billion? And as the world's richest nations gather to discuss development and inequality, is the real action happening not in the conference rooms, but in the rail yards and copper mines hundreds of miles to the north? The revelation of Zambia's pivotal role in this G20 summit came to light over the past several days, as Chinese Premier Li Qiang embarked on what many are calling the most significant visit to Zambia by a Chinese leader in nearly 3 decades. Let's establish the context. The G20 Summit opened this weekend, November 22nd and 23rd, 2025, at the Nasrec Expo Center in Johannesburg, South Africa. This is the 20th meeting of the Group of 20 and represents a watershed moment. It is the first time the G20 has ever been held on the African continent. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has made it clear that Africa's development agenda will be front and center, with priorities including inclusive economic growth, industrialization, employment, and reducing inequality. But even as delegates began arriving in Johannesburg on Friday, November 21st, the diplomatic spotlight shifted unexpectedly northward. Chinese Premier Li Qiang, the second highest-ranking official in the Chinese government after President Xi Jinping, who himself skipped the summit, touched down in Lusaka, Zambia, on Wednesday, November 20th. This marked the first visit to Zambia by a Chinese premier in 28 years, since 1997. The purpose of Li's visit became clear almost immediately. On November 20th, in a ceremony attended by Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema and Tanzanian Vice President Emmanuel Nchimbi, China, Zambia, and Tanzania officially signed a landmark $1.4 billion agreement. The deal centers on the complete modernization of the Tanzania-Zambia Railway Authority line, known as TAZARA, a 1,860-kilometer railway originally built by China in the 1970s during the Cold War era. The timing is no coincidence. Li Qiang departed Zambia on Friday, November 21st, and flew directly to Johannesburg to participate in the G20 Summit. But by stopping in Zambia first, by making that country his priority before the summit even began, China sent an unmistakable message: Africa's infrastructure, Africa's minerals, and Africa's economic future are worth more than ceremonial speeches at international gatherings. The chronological sequence reveals a calculated diplomatic strategy. First, the groundbreaking ceremony in Lusaka. Then, the arrival in Johannesburg. And throughout, a conspicuous absence: the United States, which has boycotted the summit entirely, with President Trump branding South Africa's hosting a disgrace over claims regarding treatment of the country's white Afrikaner minority. The words spoken in Lusaka and Johannesburg over these past days tell the real story of what's unfolding. Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema, standing alongside Chinese Premier Li Qiang at the railway groundbreaking ceremony, didn't mince words about the historical significance of this moment. The Chinese people took a decision to support their brothers and sisters in Zambia in constructing the rail line to open Zambia's trade onto the sea, the Indian Ocean, having had the southern route closed because of the colonial-era issues, President Hichilema stated, his voice resonating with emotion. He went further, making it clear this wasn't just about tracks and trains. "We don't see Tazara as just a rail line," he declared. "We see Tazara as an economic corridor." That phrase, economic corridor, would be repeated throughout the ceremonies and statements. It's not transportation infrastructure they're talking about. It's a lifeline. It's economic transformation. Chinese Premier Li Qiang, for his part, framed the railway project within China's broader vision for Africa. "We want to work with Zambia to advance the cause of modernization, to build an even stronger China-Zambia community with a shared future," Li said during the ceremony. He described the railway as, and I quote, "a bond that closely ties the peoples of China, Tanzania, and Zambia." Li went even deeper into the symbolism. He praised what he called the Tazara spirit, describing it as a precious legacy forged through dedication and hard work, one that should be cherished and safeguarded. He added, "China is ready to work with Zambia and Tanzania to ensure that this railway, filled with hope, shines with renewed splendor in the new era." But perhaps the most telling statement came when Li addressed what this railway would actually accomplish. He called on the three countries to use the revitalization as an opportunity to advance, in his words, hard connectivity in infrastructure like railways, highway, and ports, while strengthening soft connectivity in customs, commodity inspection, and taxation. Meanwhile, in Johannesburg, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres offered a sobering counterpoint to these grand infrastructure visions. Many developing countries, especially in Africa, find themselves at the bottom of the value chains, Guterres said. Will the G20 be able to move in their direction? We'll see. But I think South Africa has done its part in putting those things clearly upon the table. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, one of the leaders who did attend the summit, emphasized its importance despite the American absence. The G20 is such an important gathering. It's the most important gathering for which Australia is a member, Albanese stated. 1 in 4 jobs in Australia depend on trade with partners like those in the G20. And from Germany, Chancellor Friedrich Merz provided perhaps the most direct acknowledgement of the geopolitical shift occurring. "The African states are searching for partnerships," Merz said simply. "And so I will go to Johannesburg in any case and hold talks there." Back to the railway project. A representative of the China Railway Corporation laid out the concrete objectives. The improvements, he said, will significantly raise freight capacity, enabling the system to move up to 2.4 million tons of goods annually. That's a massive increase from the current capacity of approximately 400,000 tons. President Hichilema added a personal touch to his remarks about the railway, speaking directly to what it means for Zambia as a landlocked nation. Honored to receive Premier Li Qiang of the People's Republic of China for the groundbreaking event to revitalize Tazara, he wrote on social media. "This is a $1.4 billion investment in our vision for land-linked Zambia." The contrast with the American position couldn't be starker. While specific quotes from U.S. officials about the boycott remain focused on internal South African issues, the U.S. absence speaks volumes. 18 of the world's 19 major economies are represented in Johannesburg. Only one is missing. So what does all of this actually mean? Let's peel back the layers of what's happening here, because this story is about far more than a railway or a summit. First, consider the geopolitical context. The G20 represents approximately 85% of gross world product, 75% of international trade, and 56% of the global population. When the United States, the world's largest economy and a founding G20 member, boycotts such a gathering, it creates a vacuum. And vacuums, in geopolitics, don't remain empty for long. China appears to be filling that vacuum with remarkable speed and strategic clarity. By stopping in Zambia before the G20, by signing a $1.4 billion infrastructure deal, by making Africa's development a priority over diplomatic niceties, Beijing is demonstrating an alternative model of engagement. It's a model that emphasizes concrete infrastructure investments over rhetorical commitments. The Tazara Railway project itself deserves deeper scrutiny. This isn't just about moving goods. Zambia is Africa's second-largest copper producer after the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the world's seventh-largest producer overall. Copper is absolutely critical to the global transition to renewable energy and electric vehicles. Every wind turbine, every solar panel, every electric vehicle battery requires substantial amounts of copper. The railway modernization will connect Zambia's copper belt to the Tanzanian port of Dar es Salaam on the Indian Ocean. Under the agreement, China will operate the railway concession for 28 years before formally handing it back to Zambia and Tanzania. During those 28 years, Chinese firms will have privileged access to transport critical minerals from Zambia and potentially the Democratic Republic of Congo to global markets. Now, contrast this with other infrastructure initiatives in Africa. The United States and European Union have backed the Lobito Corridor, a separate railway project linking mining regions in Zambia, and the DRC to Angola's Atlantic port of Lobito. Japan supports the Nacala Corridor. What we're witnessing is a competition for influence, expressed through infrastructure. The timing raises questions about coordination and strategy. Why announce this deal now, just days before the G20? Some analysts suggest it's about demonstrating results while others merely talk. China can point to $1.4 billion in concrete commitments while other nations debate communiques. The US boycott adds another layer of complexity. 7 of the G20's 19 member countries didn't send their heads of state or government to Johannesburg. Chinese President Xi Jinping skipped it. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum declined to attend. Russian President Vladimir Putin couldn't travel due to an International Criminal Court arrest warrant. Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto sent his vice president instead. But only the United States boycotted entirely, sending no delegation whatsoever. From South Africa's perspective, hosting this summit was meant to put African development at the center of global economic discussions. President Ramaphosa had explicitly stated that Africa's development would be at the top of the agenda. The priorities included global debt reform, inclusive economic growth, industrialization, and reducing inequality. These aren't abstract goals for African nations. They're existential challenges. The European Union announced a new critical minerals agreement with South Africa during the summit, and Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced a commercial deal for a British rail company to assist with South African rail network reform. These are significant commitments, but they pale in scale compared to China's $1.4 billion Zambian railway deal. There are unresolved questions about the sustainability and terms of these Chinese infrastructure investments. Zambia itself recently emerged from a serious debt crisis, and China remains its largest creditor, with substantial stakes in the mining sector. Critics argue that such deals can create dependency relationships and debt traps. Proponents counter that African nations need infrastructure investment from any source willing to provide it, and that concerns about debt are often overstated compared to the infrastructure deficit Africa faces. The environmental dimension cannot be ignored either. In February 2025, Chinese mining subsidiaries in Zambia were involved in a toxic spill that contaminated the Kafue River near the city of Kitwe. 50 million liters of acidic waste from a tailings dam destroyed farmland and prompted nearly 200 Zambian farmers to file an $80 billion lawsuit demanding compensation and environmental remediation. Premier Lee's visit occurred against the backdrop of this ecological catastrophe, yet neither side addressed it publicly during the railway ceremony. From a broader developmental perspective, Africa desperately needs infrastructure investment. The continent has an estimated infrastructure funding gap in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Railways, in particular, are crucial for landlocked countries like Zambia, which face higher transportation costs that make their exports less competitive globally. The question becomes, on what terms should this infrastructure be built? Who benefits? Who bears the risks? And how do African nations navigate between competing global powers, each offering different models of engagement? So there you have it, viewers. World leaders gathered in Johannesburg for a historic first G20 Summit on African soil. But while they deliberated in conference rooms, the real action unfolded in Zambia, where a $1.4 billion railway deal was signed, where China demonstrated its commitment to African infrastructure, and where the future of critical minerals trade was being shaped. This story is far from over. The railway modernization will take years to complete. The geopolitical competition for African resources and influence will intensify. And the questions we've raised today about development, debt, environmental protection, and sovereignty will continue to demand answers. What do you think about China's strategy in Africa? About the US boycott of this G20 summit? About the role of infrastructure in development? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's have a real conversation about what's happening on our continent and what it means for Africa's future. Thank you so much for watching another edition of InspirAfrica Official. We'll be back soon with more stories that matter, more analysis that goes deeper, and more coverage of the forces shaping our world. Until next time, I'm Nakash. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep inspiring Africa.